Test, test, test. Hey. I think it looks better on this projector. Don't you agree?
Is that the one from the lab?
Yeah.
It's crooked though, so it just needs to be.
Yeah, if you don't mind playing with that. Nope. Do you have an extension cord too, by any chance? I wasn't able to find one other.
There's some in the lab.
I wasn't able to find any.
They're down in the bottom of those big cabinets. There should be some in there.
Okay.
What's your estimate on duration for the presentation? Uninterrupted.
I think it was probably, when I did it very slowly, it was an hour, so it's probably going to be closer to 50 minutes, 55.
So I'll introduce everyone briefly. Is Roger coming?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, cool. Good, that makes my life
I'll do kind of a introduction to the process and the committee members.
Great.
And then I'll make the request that if there's any quick questions, to go ahead and ask them for clarification,
Okay.
but to hold off on anything for more discussion until after.
Okay, sounds good.
Did you make some handouts?
No, I didn't have time to do that, but I can go and try and.
Probably should, yeah. Do some coffee and donuts kind of thing.
My parents are getting that.
Okay, so you should be all set. Let me know if you need anything.
Okay.
There's another power strip right there. I'll use one of these chain.
Okay.
That should probably work right there. Okay, let me know if you need anything.
Thanks.
That does look better.
Yeah. Morning.
Hello. Nice project, huh?
What's it?
Is that your project?
Yeah.
Nice.
Thank you.
Senior project?
It's my PhD.
Yeah, oh, I'm sorry, okay.
No, it's cool.
Who are you working with?
Dave Kloss.
Ah, okay. He just mentioned to me that he was having a PhD just about to finish.
That's me.
Yeah, okay. Good luck. So
Thank
you're
you.
defending today?
Yeah.
Awesome.
What's your name?
I'm Sedat Berincin.
Okay.
Yeah.
Nice to meet you.
Have you been my student ever? No, okay. You haven't taken a flus or terror or something?
No.
Alright, okay.
Got through without that.
Alright, good luck to you.
Thank you.
I'm sure you'll do well.
Thank you.
I forgot to ask you one thing. Did you get the signature sheet?
No. She said she's gonna be in today.
What's that?
She said she's in today, but I didn't get a chance. Do you mind running and grabbing it? Because I still need to read Steve's comments and print out that slide sheet.
Okay, yeah, go ahead and make sure you get the slide sheets printed out. I would print 6 copies,
Okay.
front and back, with the 6 per page as we talked about in the print format.
Okay.
Okay, I'll go grab the sheet. So Steve sent you comments ahead of time?
Yeah. He said he just had brief comments, and I didn't. Just want to make sure I saw him in case.
Anything
He said nothing major at all. I just wanted to.
anything good that came out of it? Interesting.
I haven't. Literally, am opening them right now. So
All right, I'll grab the form.
thank you. Hey,
What's up?
looking for someone?
Huh? I was seeing whether you were providing snacks or I should go get my own breakfast.
They're coming.
Oh, they are?
Yeah.
Oh, sweet. All right. What'd you get? Fried chicken?
Bagels and cream cheese and coffee. Nothing exciting, unfortunately.
Did they take out the regular projector?
No, it just sucks. Just anywhere in the back's probably fine. Just over there.
Hello. Hello. John Turner. Oh, hi. Nice to meet you.
Sandy?
Hi. Good to meet you. Robert worked for me over at SNC for a while.
Yes.
Yeah, he is such a bright guy. So hardworking. So his resume is sound. All the things. There he is.
Hey, John, good to see you.
Good to see you too.
Do you meet my parents?
Yes, I did.
Here's coffee and food.
All the stuff to butter up the committee. What about me? We're like best buddies.
So you guys are in California?
Yes, the coffee and bagels are pretty good. Probably not in the front.
Yeah, I figured.
But you know what? You want to.
Right?
People are kind of snobby here in that area. Beer and coffee. This is my first. Volume of work in this was crazy. Isn't it weird how that works sometimes? So what do you think of all of it? Yeah, like 2 hours. I used to for 26 years. Yeah, but the pollution, humidity, bugs, flat, and we just want to say that. Right, this is much better. Thank you. So I got a list of all the typos I've found.
Good, good.
Misspellings, grammar. Well, this is weird. I expected the engineering building to have plugins for each of the tables.
Not this engineering building. This is just a handout of condensed handout of the slides.
Okay. Got all my notes here already.
Good. How are things going at SNC?
Really good. It's kind of a weird time because we won, but NASA hasn't funded the main activity yet, so we can't hire them.
Yeah.
But we keep hearing that they're working to make something happen soon. And the interesting thing is they haven't had, it took them a while to meet with us after winning,
Oh, really?
but they haven't met with the other winners yet, at least as of last week.
Huh.
So it looks like they really are putting special emphasis on us, and I think part of it is Boeing is doing such a bad job on commercial crew that they want to keep us as an alternative for crude. So they've told us, for example, keep your docking capability.
Okay.
Because we said we could dock over Earth, and docking is required for
Right.
crude. So,
Are they okay with you not having windows then for crude?
well, no, the crude version would still presumably have windows. Now, if we go back to that, we'll have to readdress that because I don't know if
Okay.
it's
Right.
really honest. But our astronauts will probably have something to say about that.
Sure.
You can give them a view that's even much better
Right.
than a window without the risk of
And-
having a window.
Right. All the augmenting technology on the screens too.
Yeah, it's like the fighter pilot helmet now that you can look down through the floor of the airplane behind you. And we have looked at all of that stuff. But no, we'll have to back out to a crew design if we get
That one's good news too.
Yeah, I'm actually going to use, I really like the historical summary dissertation, and I'm going to use pieces of it because I'm in a little argument with John and Steve about alternative launch vehicles and whether or not I want to require single fault tolerant and reliability target. And they're saying we don't want to give them any requirements.
Yeah.
And so what my approach was, I'm writing a policy for all exploration systems that would tell them to do it as a program.
Right.
And I might use the some historical
Oh, good.
data summary to say, look, all the way back to Redstone and LSD,
Right.
they require people, if these guys aren't doing this today, if your concern is to become a cost driver, if they're not doing it today, we shouldn't be doing it.
Well, I've been keeping in touch with Curtis Paxton because he and I do rescue together, so I see him pretty
Yeah.
frequently. But he's been keeping me abreast of everything going down. And it's a pretty exciting time, and now it's very, very busy and
Right.
ramping up.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff happening, but we don't really have enough people to
Right.
do it right. So,
Well,
what are your plans when you finish?
so I have 2 more months out at the FAA and UC. So I'm going to finish up there and just finish up some papers and be a little bit more relaxed about doing it.
More papers. I've never seen that many papers in a dissertation.
Oh, good. That makes me feel good.
Oh my gosh, when I was doing it, they were like, you need at least a couple.
Right. Thanks.
There's got to be like 8.
There's, something like that. So I've got just a bunch that are kind of drafts that need to get finished up. So,
Yeah, I have all kinds of ideas in my head. I just don't have time to do.
yeah. The good thing is that these next 2 months I'm funded by them. So I'm funded to write these papers. So
That's awesome.
little opportunity to get some stuff published.
Yeah, they don't have their act together either. They are not. They don't have any kind of clear, consistent voice on spacecraft stuff.
It's been really weird being there too because they're just sort of more policy based than
Yeah.
engineering based, and
Yeah.
it's just a completely
Did you meet
different.
George Neal?
Mhm.
Yeah, he used to be a shuttle flight integration manager, and he used to go by Dr. George Neal at NASA, which I'm glad something. History major. I think it was history or public policy. Pretty sure it was history.
Oh,
It's
wow.
not a technical.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. Or did
That's
you
pretty
meet
cool.
Tom? There's a safety guy that worked for SAS for a while and helped us out. Tom.
It doesn't sound too familiar. But yeah, it's just been is what it is, but it's just people kind of quietly working and typing away in their cubicles.
It's weird. I guess it's a little like this. It's emotion. Everyone's got their agenda.
Right.
And since they don't necessarily care about facts and data, emotions and the agenda rules, I guess they don't know for sure.
So,
Hey there.
good to see you.
Yeah, you too.
Thanks for coming.
Yeah, well, thanks are due to you. Hi there.
Hi.
Dr. Dr. Turner, this is
Good to meet you.
a handout I have for you. It just covers all of this. It's a condensed version of the talk I'm giving today. So.
No,
Okay.
Robert found
Oh, I think we did the previous meetings, or maybe you weren't there.
No, I wasn't there. I was out of town.
Yeah, pretty, but some what we did talk about was
I can't imagine.
Yeah, it's a moving target.
Yeah, actually, it's like
Current contract's 9 years. Yeah.
Policy implications of that?
policy evaluation. The successor code.
Yeah, so that's a government program, so the definition is up to.
Well, the answer was it depends on what's
Yeah.
Yeah, all big government technical programs have kind of that. Because they never start out with a clear set of.
Yeah, they have like, as long as they have
Key driving
They're-
requirements.
my problem is
They
everything
go
is
through the
like-
process. I
they
mean, it's funny.
depend on like hash function and stuff, and the whole second half of the day is showing all this bullshit.
Because take pictures, healthcare. or-
You're getting excited. Yeah. Choose the good one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Figure out where the politics are. Where the
Yeah,
costs
it's like,
are. And they just don't want that.
you kind of have to get
that. It's profound skepticism.
Yeah, and that's
And since 2006, it's been like $1 million.
Well, it's hard to see this before, right?
Capsule.
I mean, my God,
Are you surviving this?
And really little show for it.
remember when I saw
So
you
the
being
test flight they did on Earth was
Yeah.
not much of that. And yeah, it's very discouraging. Commercial programs are doing pretty well.
Yeah. You're committed to their own period.
No politics there.
Yeah, the big guy who did the only the providers for message. I'm with SNC. You suggested that.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just,
It was pretty heavy in the space policy issues.
Okay, if I said yeah.
Yes.
And then as a later,
Sure.
space has a
Oh, God.
scholar
Oh, God.
was dead. There's nothing
Austria, interesting. Austrian, right?
got the same sort of arguments over and
well, and the single one was early.
Because he identified
The via
A bunch
German.
of
Via Germany.
history. guys keep
Thank you, I appreciate that.
safety.
I don't know if he likes it.
And
That's
And that
to
handout.
establish more like a unitary
It's just essentially a condensed version of
places. They try to move to test it. So they return, they actually.
How are you doing?
Significant aspects of the qualitative framework, so there are things that are in favor of the analysis, which doesn't have
No, that's not
the
true.
precision.
Oh yeah, by the way, I'm out here for this.
And I say that ever, the first shuttle risk.
All right.
For volunteers.
Interesting.
Plus the way that my funding worked out, I have already been given back.
Hey, Jim.
I make someone else
Hey, John.
Good.
How are you?
Recognize you already.
That's right, yeah. It's in disguise.
Doing that.
Trying to make myself look old.
Is it successful?
Yeah,
Actually, appreciate handout for you.
Yeah.
Personally.
It used to be, yeah.
Well, I tried to do a bit with the human red and patchy, and it's the only time ever. And I said, no, this isn't gonna work.
Why not a suggest working in the military all those years, finally retired from the military.
Yes, you can say hello to them.
Just give it time.
Sorry, they're just the slides on the screen.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, we're doing, we're partnering with over AT10 and a half.
Good to see you.
You guys are still being congratulations.
Thank you.
That's
Let's go to my committee members and you're saying congratulations to them. That's a big thing.
Determine the habitable volume after you put all the equal stuff in it. So we've been helping them define all the stuff. Habits. It's been interesting.
Yeah.
I didn't intend to do this. We're doing 2 days a week. Enjoy doing other stuff.
Talking out of you, did you check out that video?
Have you floated that once lately?
No.
No, not
It's
yet.
awesome.
It was
I will look at
I
it.
told him to
Oh,
get
good.
There you go.
Which one for you?
Are you around?
I don't know where you'll
I
be.
actually-
Help
I
on June
might
6th.
also just be kind of
But the
staring
US
at
one
the
is
wall.
fascinating.
It's not so far
Oh, really? Well, I will stay
It's
here.
getting painted.
That sounds good. June 2nd.
We had the
How are
picture
you
of them
enjoying
flying
it?
over the test for
It's good so far.
Good.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
No, it's a video of MIT.
He's got such a
It's
attention to
3D
detail.
printed solids and nodes together.
It's definitely different.
Yeah.
And make sure it's a permanent move.
Yeah.
What are the materials you're using?
They didn't say on the little press
Like supervisor.
Even to make sure, I'm sure he drives me crazy.
Oh, yeah, oh, yeah.
But it was cool. They printed out they printed out a robot like ready to go. It's all like X like thing for a drive shaft. And
The guy who
called
owns the
fellows that was progressing to make it like walk around. Pneumatic axle. Yeah. It was awesome. It was fun. And then they had I hadn't seen this, but they had soft materials they used as well. They made
Was this to this?
We're always.
Yeah, we saw
It's
some
big bus here. 2 levels.
It's completely probably.
Not surprised. And then there's the.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, I did, yeah. It's just all those all touchscreen. That's how they approach it. All touchscreen.
I just
Which is
got
me,
it.
if I was one, I'd want some back.
Yeah, I would think that they do it.
Hey.
Because you always want to do things. If
All right.
you lose your against your computer.
Right. I think part of the argument is always get to the, which I really happen, which you can screw. Was sort of having a couple of.
Yes.
I think we've met audience, sure, they.
Yeah.
I think I've always has it crossed some of them. So
Things that.
maybe you're in the paper. Very happy. Thanks for joining. You're in the.
I don't know yet.
fast that
Well,
he's
you
going.
have to be able to
It's
find
definitely one of those things
at
where
least have some
road
physical
climbing is
experience.
not the first system on this. All you see is the map, and then there's just a click on the other side.
Yeah,
So it's how you probably figure out what you want to do.
Yeah, so it's kind of the whole, that's all we have to figure out policy, so about
Yeah, great, too.
Yeah, public policy.
Space policy.
Space policy. I did mine now.
Okay.
Probably,
All right.
I think the last one I published on space policy. I may have a toe in it.
Yeah, I think this rounds out.
Yeah, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Everything else
It's good to see.
It's good so far.
Okay, well, thanks for coming.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess we can go ahead and get started. Maybe not safe enough. All right, so as you all know, we're here to participate in Robert's final defense for his PhD. And Jim asked me this yesterday. He like, what is a defense? What's it all about? And, and I thought, gosh, that's a good question. It's one of those things that seems like it's so simple, but when you try to explain it, it's not. And really, what it is to defend your PhD, I like the European system. The advisor doesn't even go to the final defense. Like, you're on your own, go defend yourself. So my job's done. I'm basically here just to facilitate this meeting and hopefully sign off on everything. So getting the PhD, as several of you in the room know from recent experience, is demonstration of a novel and significant challenge, and a solution, I guess, is more appropriate. So identifying a challenge, figuring out how to approach it, how to solve it, ideally publishing or patenting, and Robert's got a number of papers out already, so it's somewhat already vetted. He's chosen to explore space safety and risk analysis in a novel way, and significance being the relatively defined by some of his earlier work at Sierra Nevada in this field. He's already shown he can work in this area, and more recently with the FAA Center of Excellence. Beyond that, it's also mastering of the rest of the curriculum, the advanced coursework, so this is kind of the culmination today. The format this morning will be about an hour presentation, and I would ask that you hold any significant questions until afterwards. If you have a quick need of clarification, by all means jump in. And otherwise, the first hour is for public presentation. After that, the committee will convene with Robert individually, so I ask you to leave after the first hour. Okay, so the committee, we'll start down here. Well, myself, Professor Dave Klaus, I've been the chair of Robert's committee, and been a real pleasure, and he's taught me a lot, like every student I have. I learn as much as they do in some ways, I think, every time. I just forget it more often. Professor Jim Nabity is also regular faculty in our department. John Turner is at Sierra Nevada, and Robert worked with him directly for a number of years over there on the Dream Chaser. Roger Pelkey is in space policy background in environmental studies department. So he's got an interesting mix, really the policy side of things. Jim Voss, a former astronaut on our faculty here now, who's experienced the risk and safety aspects of spaceflight. And Steve Chappell, who's working in this area right now down at JSC, also a former student from here. So really good, appropriate mix of a committee. And with that, Robert, I'll turn it over to you and tell us your story.
Thank you for the introduction. Thanks everybody for coming today. This is a really big turnout. I feel like I've kind of already failed in not bringing enough food, but that's a good thing because that means I've got a good turnout. So I appreciate you coming. My talk today is entitled Defining, Characterizing, Establishing Safe Enough Risk Thresholds for Human Spaceflight. I'm really, really thrilled to have this topic. As most of you guys know, I've been really passionate about spaceflight for a very, very long time, since I was a little kid. My mom actually found the other day a little picture of me from space camp when I was 10 years old. So this has really been a passion of mine for quite a while. And as a lot of people know as well, during my kind of off time, I tend to do things that involve a fair amount of risk. So this topic tends to is a marriage of two things that I'm very passionate about, which is spaceflight and risk. Now, I'll go into detail about some of these terms, safe enough, risk thresholds, but I'd like to start out with a quote from Glenn Lunny. Now, he was an Apollo and Gemini flight director, and I think he characterized the kind of heart of this dissertation thesis. And his quote was this. He said, "When we first started, people would say things like, well, the spacecraft's got to be good, but what the hell does good mean?" And I think that really captures kind of the true intent of this thesis defense. Now, this question, what the hell does good mean? There have been variations of it throughout the space age for the last 50 to 60 years. In Mercury, it was how simple is safe. That became what does it mean to be reliable in Gemini? What the hell does good mean in Apollo? And then is the risk commensurate with the benefits prior to the shuttle program? Now, in the last decade or so, and it looks like it's a little cut off here, the question has morphed into how safe is safe enough? Now, we've seen this question in 6 out of the 8 annual reports of the Aerospace Safety Advisory Panel. Now, this is a committee charged by Congress with evaluating NASA on their safety performance. This has become a big question recently. And the reason it's still a question today, as it was 50 years ago, is that there isn't a universal answer. There's no universal right answer, right? So different programs flying different vehicles on different missions are going to have to ask this question and answer it each time. So there's no universal right answer. In fact, there's actually multiple right answers, you could say. This chart over here represents the number of uncrewed launches prior to first human flight. So take a look here. This is the Mercury Redstone rocket. It was launched 73 times before Alan Shepard was launched on a 15-minute suborbital flight in 1961. Compare that to 7 years later, 1968. First, the Saturn V, which sent Americans to the moon, was only test launched twice before it sent humans. And then if you look even further, the shuttle was test flown 0 times, excluding the approach and landing test. So there are multiple right answers to this question, and there's also multiple techniques to answer this question. I've highlighted 3 that I've found in the literature. There's the practical-based, hazard-based, and requirement-based. Now, the practical-based one is really more anecdotal, but I really like it because it captures some of the challenges we have with determining safe enough. And it's best presented by analogy. During the early 1920s, the U.S. Postal Service was charged with delivering airmail across the country. So they created this route system. And they had one edict, and that was no interruption of service by rain, snow, or other weather conditions. This was on their pamphlets that they were distributing when they first began the airmail service. So it was very clear that the purpose of the airmail was to transmit letters across country. Now, the problem with that is rain, snow, and other weather conditions are easy for today's commercial aircraft to navigate through with GPS, de-icing boots, IFR, radio navigation, that sort of thing. But in the early 20s, all those technologies were in their very, very infancy. So there was a particular stretch over the Alleghenies known as Hell's Stretch. And during the time period between 1918 and 1921, there's roughly 1 in 400 people who were killed doing this route. Now, as a means of comparison, today's commercial aviation, there's about 1 in 64 million passenger fatalities, to give you a sense of the real risk they were facing. So how did they solve this? There wasn't a hard and fast regulation or rule, but just a kind of general statement, and it was this. If an outgoing pilot desired, his supervisor had to join him in the cockpit to fly a circuit around the airport before the pilot went off on his mail run. Quickly, the supervisor's tolerance for bad weather dropped. So this is a great little anecdotal description of safe enough, but it's very subjective, right? What the supervisor thinks is safe enough is going to differ from supervisor to supervisor, as well as within the supervisor from time point A to time point B. So that's one of the challenges we have with this practical based methodology, which isn't really quite used anymore. Now, this hazard-based method is something that was used kind of in the early NASA timeframe, and it relies on what's called a hazard analysis. And so, for those of you who aren't familiar with the hazard analysis, it's basically 4 major steps. You identify hazards that can trigger undesirable outcomes. You identify causes that can engender each hazard. Then you identify controls that can mitigate or eliminate each hazard. And then you identify verifications to ensure the control is in place. Now, when you're trying to determine safe enough with this technique, you have to ask two questions. Has the process been as comprehensive as possible? And does each hazard have one or more controls in place? And if you can answer yes to those questions, the vehicle can be considered safe enough. And there are multiple problems with this methodology. First of all, experts tend to be prone to all sorts of different kinds of errors, even though they are experts. The other thing is, comprehensive as possible is a very subjective term. What's as comprehensive as possible to a PhD student who's trying to finish his dissertation might be different than his advisors. The other issue we have is it specifies that a control needs to be in place, but there's no specification for the quality of the control, right? So it could be a great control that works to mitigate the hazard, or it could be a not so great control. There's nothing in place. So it's a very subjective, it can be subject to different a level of subjectivity where there can be differences in how I interpret safe enough versus someone else determines safe enough. Let's take a look at this requirement-based method. This seems to be the method that NASA's gone to in the last 10 years or so, since they came out with their human rating requirements for space systems back in 2008. Essentially, it's this. If a spacecraft meets all of their requirements in a specific requirement set, it can be considered safe enough for flight. Now, there's a couple of issues with this setup. One, what happens when a requirement actually adds risk to the system? I've spoken about this a number of times, but failure tolerance in certain instances can add risk to the spacecraft by introducing complexity to the system. I'm happy to discuss this with you in more detail. This is one of my favorite topics, but I'll just leave it at that. So you have this weird situation where you've added a requirement, or a spacecraft has met all of its requirements, but is considered safe enough by this metric, but is actually riskier than a spacecraft that hasn't met all of its requirements and is considered not safe enough. Another issue with this, I think, and one of the bigger issues, is take a look at spacecraft A and spacecraft B. Now, there's only one major difference between them. Spacecraft B has requirement N not checked off. But you can't compare the relative risk between these two vehicles. There's no way to do it. There's no way to quantitatively say this one is significantly riskier, or in some cases, potentially less risky. So this methodology doesn't really allow for quantitative risk comparison. So my goal with this dissertation is to work on eliminating some of this subjectivity and develop something that's a little bit more quantitative and objective when determining safe enough. So hopefully mitigate some of these issues that we've seen in the other three methodologies that we presented. So to do this was kind of a three-step process, which was handy because the thesis is supposed to have three major chapters. And that's define the terminology, characterize the risk, and then establish the risk threshold, which is kind of the bread and butter of this dissertation. In terms of defining terminology, it answers three questions. What does it mean to be safe? What does it mean to be unsafe? And what does risk mean? In terms of characterizing risk, we answer two questions. How should it be measured? Should it be measured using an actuarial metric? Should it be measured probabilistically? And then how risky is spaceflight, and both from an absolute and relative perspective. Lastly, when we establish the risk threshold, we answer the question, what does safe enough mean? What's that definition of safe enough? And then lastly, what minimum level of risk can be achieved? Now, this is kind of all just kind of hazy and weird terms that I'm throwing out there to you, especially if you haven't been studying this for the last 5 years like I have. So I wanted to present an analogy which I think really captures this process. And I like it for two reasons. I call it the luggage analogy. And the luggage analogy is good because it shows how universal this kind of define, characterize, and establish is when you're determining enough of anything. And it also does a good job because it presents kind of the hidden complexities in determining enough, right? So consider yourself a commercial airline and you're trying to eliminate you're trying to limit the amount of baggage your passengers bring on board. So your question that you're asking is, how much luggage is too much luggage? Well, first you need to define what you're talking about in terms of luggage. Are you talking about carry-on or checked-in bags, right? Suitcase is probably very obviously luggage, but is a jacket that you bring on board considered luggage? Is a bottle of water considered luggage? All these sort of things that when you start to think about it, and you all I'm sure have flown on airlines, you're like, well, this isn't luggage. I don't know what the definition of luggage is, and you start to realize that you need clear terminology before you can really understand how much luggage is too much luggage. The next thing you might want to ask is, how is luggage going to be measured? So for checked bags, you measure it based on weight. But for carry-on bags, you measure it based on volume. So what are you going to choose? Are you going to choose volume, weight? Some airlines limit the total number of bags you can carry on board. The next thing you want to ask is, how much luggage do passengers generally carry? Now, an astute airline is going to ask this question because they just want a general sense of how much luggage their passengers are carrying on board. They're not going to want to limit it to 1 pound or 1,000 pounds. They're going to want a general sense of what their passengers are carrying on board. The next thing they want to ask is, what does too much luggage mean? Now, there's a very physical limitation to the amount of luggage that can be carried on board an aircraft. But that's also very true with risk as well. There's a downward limitation. You can't have negative risk on a vehicle. And you can't have, as we'll see in this talk, you can't have zero risk on a vehicle. But you also need to balance that out with what's acceptable from a passenger standpoint. A passenger is probably going to choose a different airline if they decide that the airline that you're flying only allows 1 pound a bag each, right? So then the next question becomes, what minimum level of luggage can the airlines get away with? So hopefully that analogy sheds a little insight into this process that we've gone through. So let's start with the first part. Let's define the terms. And this is a real challenge. As I mentioned in the luggage analogy, the very nature of safety determinations and the widespread confusion about the nature of safety decisions would be dispelled if the very meaning of the term were clarified. So this is not something that I'm just having trouble with in terms of definitions. This is a widespread issue in the aerospace community. And I like to present this with an analogy. So this is kind of going to be your turn to take part in this presentation. So I've listed a number of characterizations of a number of different vehicles, and I want you to raise your hand if you think this characteristic is safe or unsafe. Okay, so first pilot is killed flying it, safe or unsafe?
Don't know yet.
40 years without an accident. Safe? Okay. 2 accidents in 4 years, safe or unsafe?
Depends.
100 missions without a fatality, safe or unsafe? 2 in-flight aborts.
Depends if it was 2 flights or not.
The committee members are asking the good questions. No lives lost in 16 billion miles. Safe or unsafe?
Maybe.
Right? So this is a trick question because these characteristics all describe the Soyuz spacecraft. So you've mentioned that they were safe and unsafe for the same vehicle. So this can be a real issue when you're describing things. So I decided to dig in and look at NASA's definition of safety and use that kind of as a building block to develop a new definition of safety. NASA describes safety as freedom from those conditions that can cause death, injury, occupational illness, damage to or loss of equipment or property, or damage to the environment. So given this definition, a spacecraft can exist in either one of 2 states. It can be safe, where the spacecraft is free of all these conditions, or it can be unsafe, where the spacecraft is not free of all these conditions. Now that's a good starting point, but then you start to ask the question. You ask, can a spacecraft be free of all these conditions that can cause harm? Can anything really be free of conditions that can cause harm? This is a micrometeorite and orbital debris. It's probably one of the biggest hazards astronauts face today. But then you realize that the hazard isn't even just in space. Once they've landed, potentially an astronaut could step outside of his vehicle and get hit by a meteorite, right? So that hazard isn't mitigated even just by landing. One of the great examples that I like to use is this cup of coffee seems so innocent and straightforward and not an issue. But the FAA has actually issued a number of advisory circulars stating that the coffee makers can cause burns on commercial aircraft. There's even been one example of a coffee maker on an aircraft that caused an electrical short, which led to a loss of hydraulic failure, which led to lack of braking action, which led to a number of fatalities, right? So there are these things that we see in our everyday lives that can potentially be hazardous. So the answer to this question is, really, there is no such thing as a safe spacecraft. In fact, the SLA Committee and the Aerospace Safety Advisory Panel have said that safety organizations cannot assure safe operation. So let's go ahead and update this definition to what I call the unachievable safe state, where the spacecraft is free of all these conditions, therefore the spacecraft is unachievable in practice. It's only a theoretical state. Now let's look at this definition of unsafe that we have. Now implicitly, we all know that there are kind of degrees of unsafe, but given this definition, we've just kind of got this black and white answer. Actually, just a black answer, really, because it's just one state. Everything is unsafe, and that's not very fun to work with when you're a PhD student. So let's think about this a little bit, right? So we implicitly understand that the number of hazards affect the degree to which a spacecraft is unsafe. Something that a spacecraft that's exposed to 2 hazards is probably going to be a little bit more unsafe than a spacecraft exposed to 1 hazard, all things being equal. Likelihood also affects the degree of unsafe. If a hazard is 99% likely, the spacecraft is probably a little bit more unsafe than a hazard that's 1% likely. And we also know that severity also plays a role. So a critical hazard is going to be less worrisome than a catastrophic hazard. So we can update these definitions, and instead of kind of these discrete states, we've got one discrete state here, and then a spectrum of values of unsafe, measured based on the likelihood of a catastrophic hazard occurring. Now, I've specifically chosen catastrophic hazards because that's an area of interest to me, but you could theoretically change the severity level to whatever hazard you want, as long as it's consistent. And we keep this definition of unsafe the same as well. Now, there's one little extra iteration to these definitions that I have, and that's to include the definition of risk that NASA uses. NASA defines risk as the combination of the probability, qualitative or quantitative, of experiencing a catastrophic event and the uncertainties associated with the probabilities and consequences. So the only thing that changes with this model is that this framework is that we measure that we instead of referring to it as degrees of unsafe, we just refer to it as degrees of risk. So we've got these definitions in place that we've built up, and we've got a framework that we can use for defining risk and safe and unsafe. The next step we have is to characterize risk. And the very first aspect is, how should risk be measured? Now, I've kind of lumped the risk measurement techniques into 3 broad. This is not a very. This is a great quote. I really like this quote. It says, "But the core of the controversy continued to be the disagreement on how to estimate reliability, and on this point, the divisions were deep and irreconcilable." Now, this quote was in reference to the Apollo program, but what I really like about it is how universal it is. You could have told me that this quote was given right before Challenger or right after Challenger, and I would have believed you. There's always kind of been people within the aerospace community that are more quantitative when it comes to evaluating risk, and there are people that are more qualitative when it comes to evaluating risk. There's not necessarily a right answer, but there certainly is disagreement. And I'm going to walk through kind of why I chose to use the risk metric that I did and my reasons for doing so. Now, as I mentioned briefly earlier, there are you can lump it into 3 categories, and you can change it in any direction you want, however you want. There's kind of the qualitative techniques, failure modes and effects, hazard analysis, fault tree analysis. There's probabilistic analysis, and there's actuarial analysis. Now I'm going to focus on these quantitative metrics because, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, I'm working to develop a quantitative model. So while qualitative techniques are good and they can definitely provide insight into the quantitative techniques, I'm going to focus on these bottom 2 techniques. So probabilistic and actuarial. I'm going to go through them kind of step by step and give the pros and cons to each of them. So probabilistic it's basically you develop a mathematical logic model of the spacecraft, and you identify probabilities of events occurring, and you sum them together to get an overall probability of loss of truth. Now contrast that to an actuarial analysis, which is probably what more people are readily familiar with. It's kind of like if you're familiar with sports, it's kind of like a batting average or a free throw percentage or anything like that. It's your number of incidents for a given exposure period. And this is a very retrospective analysis because you can only look at past data points. Whereas with probabilistic, you can make predictions on the spacecraft's risk based on the system. So for the space, like I said there, the probabilistic is really an estimate of risk, and actuarial is really more a measure of risk. When it comes to the space shuttle, the probabilistic metric identified the risk of the space shuttle towards the end of its life as 1 in 90. The actuarial metric is actually 1 in 67.5, which is analogous to the 2 catastrophic accidents that occurred over the life of 135 flights. Ideally, though, these metrics should converge. If you have a good probabilistic metric in place, these metrics should converge. So continuing down this path and comparing the 2, probabilistic includes a measurement of uncertainty in its measurement, whereas actuarial does not. There's no measure of uncertainty. And as I was alluding to earlier, probabilistic can measure the risk of a spacecraft before its first flight, whereas actuarial cannot. Now I have this graph of a coin flip, and I think it's probably a good analogy for an actuarial analysis. Now imagine you have a coin, and you're trying to identify whether it's balanced. Balanced meaning that you have a roughly equal chance of getting heads or tails. Now you'll never know if this coin is balanced before you start flipping it. And even at the first couple of flips, you'll really have no sense of whether it's a balanced coin. So that's kind of what this emphasizes. These first 5 flips or so, you're not really certain whether it's a balanced coin. But over time, it starts to level out and become close to 50%, and you can assume that the coin is balanced at that point. One of the key issue for me, though, in determining between these 2 measurement techniques is that with probabilistic data, it tends to be limited and generally proprietary. So it's hard to access probabilistic data from Blue Origin. I'm never going to get my hands on their probabilistic data, no matter how hard I try. Whereas with actuarial data, the data is readily available, and it's provides very good insight if there are significant launches. And of course, the issue with human spaceflight is there's not a whole lot of launches. So it's kind of 6 of one, half dozen of the other issue. Now, I've chosen specifically to look at actuarial to measure risk in this thesis using actuarial risk because the data is readily available. That's not to say that probabilistic data can't be used in the model, and in fact, it can be used in the model if and when it becomes available. So I'm going to focus on actuarial data in terms of measuring risk. Now we've got another step we need to go through. I mentioned that I was interested in measuring catastrophic risk, which is generally includes loss of life. So I'm interested in fatalities and fatal accidents. So I'm going to define these terms for you. And I'm going to define them because they seem so straightforward and easy, and then you start to think about it and you realize how challenging it can be to actually count fatalities. So I define a fatality as a death that directly results from performing or engaging in an activity. That's probably pretty straightforward. It's probably very similar to what you all would have come up with if you had come up with a definition. But there are a number of issues that you need to think about when you're defining a fatality. The time frame is one of them. So let's say there's an airplane crash, and someone was really badly injured, but they managed to survive, 30 days afterwards, and then they died. Does that get included in the fatality statistics? According to the FAA, it does, but for different organizations, it might not. So when I'm comparing risk, it's really important that I make sure that I'm on the same page for all of these numbers. Do permanent injuries get included in fatality statistics? I know NASA defines fatality as a permanently debilitating injury. So if there's someone who's in a long-term coma, does that count as a fatality? In my definition, I don't count it as a fatality, but it's something to think about. What about non-participants? So if you look at aviation data in 2001, you always have this big asterisk because they don't know whether to count the fatalities of the towers. Is it just the people on board the aircraft? Is it the people who are in the towers? So these are issues that you need to think about when you're counting fatalities of a different activity. I'm also looking at fatal accidents, and fatal accidents is an accident in which one or more fatalities occur, and no qualification is given to the total number of fatalities that occur during the accident. So again, looking at the 9/11 numbers, there were 265 fatalities on the aircraft, 4 fatal accidents, and these capture. Like if you say 4 and you say 265 and you don't give the units of fatalities or fatal accidents, it can be very different numbers. So it's important to specify what you're talking about. Now the other thing we need to keep in mind is fatalities and fatal accidents are interesting, but they don't convey the whole picture. You need to also include some sort of rate unit to it as well. Now if I were to say there are 1 fatality a day, it's very different than 1 fatality over a century, right? We understand that the 1 fatality over a century is less risk than 1 fatality a day. So I decided to look at these 6 denominators: person hour, person trip, person mile, vehicle hour, vehicle trip, vehicle mile. I'm happy to discuss these kind of in more detail with you afterwards, and they're actually in the thesis, the specific definitions. But I'm going to just focus on these 2 metrics: fatalities per person trip, and fatal accidents per vehicle trip. I'm specifically going to focus on them because NASA typically measures risk in fatal accidents per vehicle trip. So Space Shuttle was 2 fatal accidents and 135 flights. I'm also really interested in this fatalities per person trip number, but for different reasons that we'll get to later. So again, just to continue to hammer home this point, these 2, the fatalities per person trip and fatal accidents per vehicle trip, are going to generate very different numbers for the same spacecraft. So this is a picture of Spaceship Two, which has suffered 1 fatality in 8 person trips so far, including the accident back in October, versus 1 fatal accident per 4 vehicle trips. Now I classify this as kind of person-centric, which is focused on the individual and the individual's risk, versus vehicle-centric, which is just focused on the vehicle and not really focused on the individual passengers. So I've looked at fatality and fatal accident data for a number of different systems. I've looked at, obviously, spacecraft in terms of Soyuz and Space Shuttle. I've also looked at commercial aviation and general aviation. And I also decided to take a look at the risk of other activities. So I looked at automobile, Amtrak, boating, and also kind of adventure sport activities, skydiving, mountaineering, scuba diving. Now, you're probably wondering, this is supposed to be a lecture on space. Why are we discussing these different activities? And there's 2 kind of major reasons I decided to look at these different activities. The first is, if you remember at the beginning of the presentation, I told you about the risk of commercial airmail pilots in the 1920s. And I gave you a number of 1 in 400, and that number kind of glosses over you, and you don't really hear it. And then when I tell you that the current risk today is 1 in 64 million, that provides context. That gives you an understanding of what the risk is relative to commercial aircraft today. And also in terms of the work I'm doing for the FAA, they're very interested in being able to communicate risk to spaceflight participants, who are people who are going to be flying on the Virgin Galactic and flying on Lynx and on those sort of spacecraft, who might not really have the insight and risk that an aerospace engineer like you guys do. So that's one of the key reasons why I decided to look at risk in other metrics. So I can say to the rich person who wants to fly on Virgin Galactic, this spaceflight is comparable to climbing Everest, and they have some sort of context in place when communicating risk. The other reason I took a look at with these relative risk comparisons is it serves as a mechanism for predicting risk later on in this dissertation. Finally, the data. You finally get to look at the data. After all these definitions and after all these descriptions, we can look at the data. So this is risk as measured on fatalities per person trip basis. And it's probably comparable to what you'd expect. Space Shuttle and Soyuz are on the high end of this risk spectrum. Pretty high, about 1 in 100. Compare that to commercial aviation, which is about 1 million times less risky. And an interesting thing, though, is that same order of magnitude as climbing Mount Everest. So if you're communicating risk to a potential commercial spaceflight participant and they've climbed Everest, it might give them some insight when you say, well, in terms of fatalities per person trips, going on the Space Shuttle and going on Soyuz is roughly comparable to climbing Mount Everest. Fatal accidents per vehicle trip. Now, fewer data points in here because I can't. Scuba diving doesn't really involve vehicles. So I'm focusing specifically on vehicles here. And the data, again, isn't very surprising. Space Shuttle is very risky, whereas kind of the terrestrial forms of navigation are over here. And not surprisingly, general aviation is kind of bumped up over here. So this is all well and good. We've defined the terms, characterized the risk. What can we do to make this into an actual PhD thesis instead of just data mining and looking at data and looking at trends? This is something that I've probably struggled with for 5 years. It took me quite a while to really kind of come to grips with the next step of this thesis, which is to establish the risk threshold, what we define. If we're going back here, at what point do we consider this to be too unsafe? So this is our framework from those first couple of slides. We said this is unachievable and that this can be measured as risk. And it's not a real conceptual leap to say that you can discriminate between safe enough and not safe enough by just establishing a line, a level of risk that you describe to be as what I call a risk threshold. Essentially, that risk threshold is a level of risk that distinguishes safe enough from not safe. Now, determining whether a spacecraft is safe enough versus not safe enough is mathematically trivial, right? You just have to calculate whether the spacecraft's risk is below this risk threshold line. The real challenge is in determining what this line should be and what's appropriate, right? That constitutes the far greater challenge. So I got to thinking about it and doing a lot of literature review and trying to figure this out. And one thing became clear to me, and that's that a good risk threshold value should balance what is maximally acceptable from a policy standpoint. So as high a risk as the policy guys are going to allow, with what is minimally achievable given technical budget and schedule constraints. So you have to balance